You're listening to the Colchester Briefing Show podcast on Anchor FM.
Alrighty. Hello, my name is Jason Batt and welcome to my podcast, the Colchester Briefing Podcast. It is Saturday afternoon, the 8th of June 2019, 2 o'clock. Okay, well, not exactly. I don't think it's... Oh, sorry. I'm not using the microphone that I normally use. Before we get into the podcast, let me just explain what microphone. I'm using this condenser mic of mine, and condenser mics require a lot of silence. And I'm at my daughter's house because Telkom, 12 o'clock the afternoon, they decide to send an SMS saying that there will be no internet services from 2 o'clock today, that's now, currently, until Monday. How lovely. Thank you, Telkom, for inconveniencing me. I mean, I like to sit in my own house, in my room, in my podcast room, where it's quiet, it's nice and soundproof. This microphone is very, very sensitive. If you hear the dogs barking in the background, please, guys, please accept my humblest apologies. If my daughter's gone to the shop now, if she comes back and she's gonna bang the keys on the table, I did ask her please not to, but my daughter, she's gonna say, "Dad, I don't care. This is my house." So okay, so guys, yeah. I like to use my low noise mic. That's why I use a low noise, where you put your mouth in it and then it only picks up your voice. It doesn't pick up any background noise. But anyway, enough of that jibber jabber. Today's podcast is about the Constitution. And my special guest with me today on my podcast is Martin van Staden. Sorry about that. Sorry. He's here today in his own capacity, private capacity, as an individual of South Africa. I mean, after all, that's what we are. We are all individuals. He knows his knowledge on the Constitution is awesome. He knows the Constitution. Unlike me, I don't know the Constitution. I mean, I might know some laws and I know some rights and that, but I think it's basically common sense. It's common logic sense that you know certain rights. I think it's you know the rights that you have to know. But there's a lot of rights out there and laws out there that we don't know, that we're not fully aware of. So, you know what? In essence, we are the uninformed. So the uninformed, which is me, namely me, and there's lots of you out there that don't understand the Constitution. So this is why that's why I'm bringing Martin onto the podcast today, so that he can give us, well, I've summarized a couple of questions, asking him what's the Constitution is. So we're going to go into, this is going to be an awesome podcast. The reason for this podcast, we need help. Okay, cool. Enough jibber jabber. I'm going on here and I'm not making sense. Let's call Martin. All right. Cool, I'm going to get Martin on the line. Hi, Martin. Are you there?
Hey, Jason. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Lovely. It's absolute pleasure for you to have on my podcast today. We're going to talk about, I did an introduction already. So we're going to be talking about the Constitution. But before we go there, what do you think about this GDP? Minus 3.2. Hey?
Yeah, everyone's surprised. I wouldn't say I'm surprised. This is the consequence of many years of making very bad policy decisions, going down a socialist rabbit hole. And I don't know, people thought this new dawn is going to turn everything around, but I've never seen any indication that President Ramaphosa is more of a free marketeer than his friends in government.
Yeah.
In fact, I've seen the exact opposite. He co-wrote a book on constitutional law in, I think, the year 2000 with Professor Ziad Motala. And it's not like when I read the section on property rights and free and the role of the state in the market, that he wrote. It's not like I get the idea that he's this capitalist paragon.
Yeah.
Instead, I get very much the idea that he is just as much of a socialist as the rest of them. So yeah, this is obviously the GDP contracting. It's a foregone conclusion. Minimum wage, 15,000 domestic workers out of a job, unemployment approaching 10 million. It's so obvious that this is going to happen, and it's obviously going to get much worse if a government doesn't have a eureka moment and say, "Wow, we're really operating under the wrong philosophy here."
Yeah, look, a lot of people are saying we need to be positive. Ramaphosa is going to do good. I suppose to a certain extent we can see he has done some good, but yeah, you know, us Africans, we're not patient. We want it now. We want to see results now, and this is the problem.
That is true, yeah.
Yeah, it's true. All right, Martin, let's give a quick introduction. Let the listeners out there, tell the listeners out there who you are.
Okay, sure. So I am Martin van Staden. I guess I describe myself as a writer and a jurist. I'm very much into jurisprudence and law, especially public law, which includes constitutional law. That's very much my hobby. I wouldn't describe myself as an expert at all. There are many other people who have read far more about the South African Constitution than I have and know far more. But it's definitely something that I think I bring a new perspective to, especially given that I am very much a libertarian, someone who believes in the primacy of individual liberty, the primacy of free markets, and you don't see that very often amongst academic lawyers and lawyers in general in South Africa. So that's what I hope to bring to the table. Now, I have written a book on constitutionalism. It's called The Constitution and Rule of Law. You can find more information about that on my website. I will definitely provide the link to that.
Please do, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm very much a passionate. I do podcasts very rarely.
Yes.
Because I much more prefer writing. So I've written quite a bit. I'm the editor-in-chief of Being Libertarian. It's an international libertarian publication. We're, I think, one of the biggest libertarian Facebook pages on Facebook with over 1 million followers. And the Rational Standard, which many South Africans who are of a libertarian mind may be familiar with, that is part of the Being Libertarian family. So I'm also an editor there. And yeah, that's basically what I'm all about. For me, it's about writing about freedom, writing about free markets, writing about law from this liberal, libertarian perspective, and basically getting ordinary people to adopt, or not necessarily adopt, but maybe to think through things that they probably think are foregone conclusions or are set in stone. For example, the idea that government must hold our hands through everything. That's something that me and many libertarian writers try to challenge, even in terms of for example, the Constitution, which many people think is this socialist document, but that is not necessarily the case. So yeah, that's a short summary of what I'm up to in my daily life. But as I said, on my website, you can find a far more comprehensive version of this introduction.
Yeah, and listeners out there, Martin will put links in. I will also provide it in my description after the podcast. So Martin, leading up to my first question, the reason for this podcast, a lot of us South Africans, we don't know the Constitution. I think to a certain extent we know a little bit of what we need to know. So yeah, so let's go. Let me just paste my question here. Here we go. What is the Constitution? What is a Constitution?
Okay, so as the name implies, a constitution is a constitutive instrument. It creates something, and then it also provides the framework for how that thing can operate. So it's very much like a contract. You set out the details of your relationship, and you say what the parties may and may not do, what they have to do. That is very much what a constitution is, but on the level of a government. So a constitution establishes a government and says how that government may operate, what it can do, and what it cannot do. Now, it does get a little bit complex because in countries like the United Kingdom and in South Africa before the year 1993, we also had a constitution, but it was not a written constitution. And in those circumstances, the constitution basically just says how things are politically. So you have the Queen, Parliament, and government, and the devolved legislatures and the municipalities in the United Kingdom, and that is Britain's constitution. So it's not written down anywhere, but it's something that you see when you look at Britain. And that was basically the same in South Africa before we adopted the written interim constitution in 1993. We did not have a written constitution. We had a parliament, the state presidency, and for a while there, the prime minister before 1983. So that was our constitution. So, but most of the world has constitutions in written as a written instrument, and I think the first one was the United States Constitution, which is the most well constitution, and it's like a contract, like I mentioned. Now, what we usually talk about in South Africa in ordinary everyday engagement and parlance is basically we're talking about the Bill of Rights. It's very rare when we talk about the Constitution that we're actually talking about like the composition of the National Assembly, which is also in the Constitution. We're usually talking about the Bill of Rights, which is in Chapter 2 of the Constitution, and this is where a number of protections for individual and human rights are set out. And this comes to what I believe and what many constitutional philosophers believe, but there is obviously some disagreement about this, what the real purpose of a constitution is, and that is to limit the power of government. So constitutions are part of the tradition of constitutionalism. It's also a word that we hear often in ordinary from the media specifically, and that's also very much a misunderstood word. But constitutionalism is this idea that no government has or should have unlimited power. So that is, in a nutshell, what a constitution is. It's a document.
Martin
Must act,
yes,
and the moment it steps outside of that framework, it is acting unconstitutionally, and it can be punished, for lack of a better word, to get it back inside the framework.
Yeah, do you see what I put down? I put the first constitution was in 1910 when the country became a union. The second constitution was in 1961 when South Africa was declared a republic. Then in 1983 and then 1994. But then it came into existence in February of 97. I think that was when Mandela, or was it 96? I got you 97. When Mandela brought it across to news outlets that has been hailed as one of the progressive constitutions in the world by global standards. And then also...
Oh, jeez.
Okay, sorry about that, listeners. The internet kicked me off, but I'm back. Where was I? I said I was talking about... Yeah, the I don't know where I cut off now. But the year in 1994 where the constitution was made up, and then 1997 Mandela brought it across. And then according to news outlets, our constitution has been hailed as one of the progressive constitutions in the world by global standards. How true is that? Is there any truth?
The term is usually it's the best constitution in the world, and that is how you need to decide what measure you're gonna measure the constitution by. Now, if they say it's the most progressive constitution, that may be one of the case, may be the case if they regard it as in this light of progressivism, where government must play a redistributionist role to take wealth from the haves and give to the have-nots. But that is, to my mind, not really how a constitution should be measured. As I mentioned, and I hope this wasn't cut out, unfortunately, now, that the purpose of a constitution is to limit the power of government within the tradition known as constitutionalism, which is the idea that no government has or should have unlimited power, that government's power must always be limited, and that is how any constitution should be read. Now, as far as the Constitution of South Africa is concerned, it does have its good and its bad sides. Now, if to say that it's the best constitution in the world by this measure of limiting government, I cannot agree with that. Because other constitutions, like the Constitution of the United States and perhaps the Constitution of Switzerland, have been far more effective at constraining the central government's power than as the Constitution of South Africa. Now, that is not to say that it's a bad constitution. I think it has many good sides, and I think it has been successful in limiting the power of government. But I can mention a few of the issues that I have identified, and some of the good sides of the Constitution in this regard. So something that is not often talked about, but something that anyone will notice if they read the Constitution, is how it sees itself in time. So its temporal dimension. So throughout the text, and specifically in the Bill of Rights, the Constitution tells the government that it needs to right the wrongs of the past. It must redress past discrimination. And there is no expiration date on these provisions, which means that the South African government will, and it has already done this, always justify any bad and invasive things that it does by saying it is simply righting the wrongs of the past, as the Constitution told it to. I mean, it's now 25 years after apartheid ended, and we still, and of course, we still see the system's legacy around us with great poverty and so forth. But the more time passes, the more it will only become a convenient political excuse to keep saying, yes, we're doing this to right the wrongs of the past. I mean, in the year 2060, how can you still say that? So it's unfortunate that the Constitution didn't give a time frame to government to work with before these ideas that government can just endlessly redress without any real rational justification. And I mean, expropriation without compensation, which I'm sure we'll get to a bit later, is one of the big examples of this. Where government is just saying, but of course we need to expropriate private property without compensation because the Constitution says we need to redress the past. So that temporal issue in the Constitution is something that I think is quite unfortunate. But perhaps to make it a bit more less abstract, I guess, is to take one of the procedural aspects of the Constitution, or the technical aspects, and that is how Parliament is composed. So we know that Parliament consists of the National Assembly. That is basically where most of the power resides. That's where the president is chosen. But then it also has this thing called the National Council of Provinces, or the NCOP, which is the upper house of Parliament. Now, the NCOP is basically a federal institution. It is meant to represent the interest of provinces on the national level and to be a check and a balance on the National Assembly to ensure that they don't enact any laws that go against provincial interests. But of course, South Africa is not a federation, even though people talk about South Africa as a so-called cooperative federation or cooperative federalism. That is just, that's nonsense. We're not completely a unitary state, but we do lean closer to having a strong central government rather than a type of competitive federalism like you see in Canada or America or Switzerland.
America. I know America's like federalism,
Yeah, so it's a very competitive federalism in America where, for example, the president may say we're restricting immigration, and then some city or something in California will say, well, you can do that, but we're now a sanctuary city, and we're going to allow illegal immigrants.
Yeah, that's what's happening.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So,
it's happening, yeah.
and that's good, because I think when different levels of government compete with each other, basically in an adversarial relationship, that benefits the people, because government is then infighting with itself rather than fighting against the people. So in South Africa, we have this NCOP, which is meant for a federation like America, but instead we have this in the unitary the state that we have, and it acts as a rubber stamp for the National Assembly, because if we're honest with ourselves, we don't have separate provincial and national interests in South Africa. We have the same problems in every province. In every province, we have the same wage disputes, we have the same corruption, we have the same mentality, I guess, of governance. The Western Cape, yeah, you can make an argument, maybe that's a bit different there, but I think on the whole, there is no real difference between national and provincial interests in South Africa. So we would have done better if we had a directly elected Senate, for example, as an upper house, that we can choose a specific representative for our district and hold them accountable to ensure that they also provide a real strong check on the National Assembly. Instead, we have this NCOP, which, I mean, if we're honest, nobody really cares about it. I mean, I did an interview with Newsroom Africa the other day on the day of inauguration when all the parliamentarians were being sworn in. And I mean, the focus was totally on the National Assembly. The National Council of Provinces wasn't mentioned once, which was also getting sworn in the next day. So it's really something that nobody cares about. It serves no real purpose. A lot of academics may get very offended that I say this, but it's simply a fact that the NCOP does nothing.
It's kind of like, you know, we're not meant to know. The majority, especially, we're not meant to know. You know?
Yeah, and that's unfortunate, because if more people were aware of this institution that was created apparently for some kind of constitutional purpose, maybe we would have been calling for reform by now. We would have said, listen, get rid of this thing and replace it, like in Canada, where they're saying abolish the Senate, the upper house of their parliament, because it's totally appointed. Nobody is elected, so they're saying get rid of it. Or the House of Lords in the United Kingdom, which is also hereditary. You inherit your seat in the House of Lords, or you get appointed, where a lot of people are saying, reform this, take it away, or reform it. In South Africa, there is none of that, because people simply do not know and do not understand.
Yeah.
But to get away from perhaps the more negative sides of the Constitution, as far as democracy goes, I think the Constitution does quite well, even though government doesn't really live up to it. So, for example, as we know, we have a system of proportional representation rather than a first-past-the-post system, whereby we elect political parties. And this, so while it does have its own downsides, it means that minority interests will also get represented in parliament. So with about 30,000 votes, a party can get a seat in parliament. Whereas if we had a first-past-the-post system like in the United States, like the UK, we would have only had the ANC and the DA and perhaps the IFP in parliament. There would be no other party in parliament, and the ANC's majority would probably be far greater than it currently is, and absolutely the ANC will probably govern the Western Cape today, which is or perhaps not today, but it would have governed the Western Cape for a longer period than when the DA came in. Yeah. So I think the proportional representation that the Constitution brought in is on the whole a good feature. And also the Constitution recognizes public participation, which says that if you're a South African citizen, or I don't even think that's necessary, you can participate in the process of creating law, creating policy. You can submit your comments, and government is constitutionally required to take this seriously, even though it doesn't. Basically, it sees that as a formality, whereby, yes, you can send your comments in, nobody reads it, they say noted, thank you very much, and they do whatever they want. But of course, for your listeners, I think it's very important that more people do actually get involved in this structure, this institution that government, that not that government gave us, but which the Constitution gave us. And I would recommend they visit the two websites, dearSouthAfrica.co.za and PMG, which is the Parliamentary Monitoring Group. It's pmg.org.za, which if you look around on those websites, you can find information about what government is currently busy with and how you can provide your input. And I would recommend your listeners have a look at that. So yeah, these are just a few things that our Constitution gave us. A few bad sides, a few good sides. Not the best Constitution in the world by far, but it's also not particularly terrible.
Yeah. Our next question, I don't know, should we skip it? I think you touched a lot of it What is the purpose of the government? We're going to skip it. Or should
I
we?
can mention just a few more notes on that, just to put it quite clearly. So, obviously, there are many ideologies, socialism, liberalism, and all of them conceive of government differently.
Yeah.
But within the liberal constitutional paradigm under which most of the world exists today, the government's role is to protect and give effect to the rights of the people under its jurisdiction. And this is, of course, where the Bill of Rights comes in. Government with these bills of rights provide the government with the necessary guidance to ensure that they know how to give effect to this purpose. Now, of course, as your listeners may know, you have you have strict liberals like libertarians like myself, who think that that government must be strictly limited to protecting property rights and to protecting liberty and so forth, not really engage in this
and that's more on the right.
nanny state.
Yeah.
So people will say it's on the right, and I think under a certain conception, it is on the right. Although it's a bit different from conservatism. But then you have more thin liberals, I guess, which people would say is the left, which believe that government should create an environment for prosperity, or itself should try to make people prosper, and specifically relevant to our conversation about the Constitution is that I think that once you go down this route of saying government must make people prosperous or government must create an environment for prosperity, that idea is incompatible with constitutionalism, because if you think of constitutionalism as limiting government, the moment you start saying government must make people prosper, you're giving it an open-ended mandate to basically decide for itself what prosperity means. Nowadays, there are people calling for data access to be made a human right, meaning that government is going to force companies like internet service providers to provide data cheaply or freely, and that is all in the name of government making people prosper. And as far as I'm concerned, that is not part of the mandate of government. It's not part of the purpose of government, and it's totally incompatible with a conception of constitutionalism.
In layman terms, it's just making people lazy. You know, people need to stand up. I mean, that's why the people, you know, that are on the right, it's individualism. You get up there, you do things for yourself. Go to school, study hard, because the rewards are there. It reaps afterwards if you study hard. But yeah.
Exactly.
All right, our next question. What is democracy and can it work?
Okay, so this is a very relevant question when it comes to constitutions and constitutionalism, because in our everyday discourse, we often use the word democracy and freedom and the constitution, all of these things basically as one. But to get this democracy specifically, most people think of it as majority rule. If half the people plus one decide to do something, that thing must then happen. And I think this is certainly part of what democracy is, but you cannot see that as the whole story, especially when you talk about the role of a constitution. So, for example, in Switzerland, which I've mentioned a few times now, it has a form of direct democracy through referendums, recall elections. So every Swiss person is allowed to participate in government, and a law cannot be passed unless most Swiss people vote for it in a referendum, and they can propose their own laws through a referendum. So this is probably the purest form of democracy that exists in the world today. But even if, for instance, in a canton, a Swiss province, the majority of people there decide that they want to do something and there's a substantial minority that disagrees with that, they can decide to form their own canton. So they can break away and then they can opt out of whatever this majority decided. And I think it once happened in California, which is also a direct democracy when it comes to its ballot initiatives. people were asked to vote on a new government project which they wanted, but then they were also asked to vote on how that project should be funded. And when they realized that the only option was to raise taxes on themselves, they voted against the project. So this is to say that democracy can take many different forms, what those that simply entrench majority rule, this 50% plus one notion, that is a flaw to democracy, because it sometimes excludes half of the whole population from decision making, and I don't think you can call any political dispensation legitimate if it only represents about half of those who it governs. It cannot be legitimate in those circumstances. And I think it's also true to say that a democracy that has no limit on democracy, but totally unbridled democracy, cannot last. It's totally unsustainable, because at some point the population is going to want to give a strongman like Vladimir Putin, like Donald Trump, like Cyril Ramaphosa. They are going to want to give this popular strongman dictatorial power, especially if they're charismatic, if they talk about helping the people, but they just need some more power. At some point the people are going to say, okay, please do this for us. And they're going to give him that power, and then democracy ends. So we modified the majoritarian principle in most democracies around the world today, because if that principle is left undiluted and pure, then democracy defeats itself. So that is why most democracies, including South Africa's, is a liberal constitutional democracy, which means that the majoritarian principle is applied but limited by the Constitution, and specifically the Bill of Rights, and then of course by the courts, which can overrule or circumvent the will of the majority when it is necessary to give effect to the limitations in the Constitution. So as I've already also mentioned, is public participation, which is another way of modifying democracy. It's not just people go and vote and say, we want this law and there it goes, or we want this party and there it goes. The people also participate at every level to formulate policy, then to formulate the law, and then to formulate the regulations in terms of the law. So that's also a limiting principle, because very few people really want to have the time or the inclination to get involved in this. But it's basically another way to say democracy is modified. You must play a role as a citizen, rather than be I don't know, an uninterested observer, because this affects you. So yeah, there are many ways that democracies are modified. It's the core of democracy is this idea that the people govern themselves, and this is mostly manifested through the majoritarian principle, but limited. And you ask, can it work? I think definitely it does work throughout the world, but it can only work under circumstances where the principle itself, the majoritarian principle, is limited and modified.
That's what I was thinking here, because I mean we are a nanny state, the majority like a nanny state. So how can it work when we are all like nannies, like a nanny state? It just won't work. All right, next question. How does the SA Constitution measure up to this in everything we were saying?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, the Constitution is not the best in the world. There are some problems, some substantial problems, like that temporal dimension, like the useless National Council of Provinces. There's also the provision that allows the president to appoint and fire ministers as it pleases him, almost arbitrarily. And we saw that, of course, a few years ago with Jacob Zuma and the finance ministry, when we had Nhlanhla Nene, and then we had Des van Rooyen, our weekend minister. and then we had Pravin Gordhan back, and then Ramaphosa appointed, or where was it still, Zuma appointed Malusi Gigaba, and then we have Pravin Gordhan back again. And I mean, geez.
All these changes.
I mean, that
damages the rand, eh? Our rand suffers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, and that's one of the unfortunate parts of the Constitution, because it gives the president this power to just appoint and dismiss as it pleases him. Now, of course, the Bill of Rights, we have this host of socioeconomic rights, and I must emphasize that the problem here is more in how the Constitution is interpreted rather than what it actually says. So a lot of these so-called welfare rights do not necessarily have to be interpreted as that. For example, the right to housing. There is no right to housing. It's the right to have access to housing and water. It's not the right to water. It's the right to have access to water. And unfortunately, our government and our courts have interpreted as being a positive right as far as government action is concerned, meaning government must provide water, must provide housing.
Yes.
And I mean, we've seen that this is not really practical in our current economic context, because this government cannot afford it, because the taxpayers cannot perpetually carry government. So it would have been far more appropriate, I would say, for the courts to say these rights mean that government must not stand in your way of providing for your own housing and for your own water,
Yes.
and rather than government must provide it itself. So the Bill of Rights can be read in more than one way, and I think the problem comes in for how the courts have read it in what I would say is a very inappropriate way. So the Constitution itself probably is okay when it comes to the Bill of Rights, but we cannot separate out how it has been read. And unfortunately, when we talk about how the Constitution then measures up to this ideal of a Constitution that limits government, it hasn't lived up to that particularly well when it comes to the so-called welfare rights in the Constitution. But as far as it goes with like freedom of expression and so forth, I think the Constitution is pretty good there. And like I mentioned, it's as far as democracy and democratic governance goes, I think the Constitution is particularly is good insofar as it provides for a democratic state. Unfortunately, of course, the government often doesn't care what the Constitution says, so it doesn't really help if the Constitution says it. Yeah,
that's the thing. Like, they don't care what the Constitution says. So, does the Constitution allow the courts or the president himself to make law?
Lawmaking is a parliamentary function. So as I mentioned, Parliament is composed of two houses. It's the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces, that useless institution, and they make law on the national level. So a majority of each house. On the provincial level, you have the provincial legislatures, and on the municipal level, you have local councils, and each of these institutions make law. The president also participates in lawmaking, although he does not make the law itself, because he has to sign any national law before it becomes operative. But of course, we shouldn't allow all the talk about the Constitution to confuse us about the real politic in South Africa, which is that the president of South Africa is usually also the president of the ruling party, in this case the ANC. And this means that he likely plays a far bigger role in lawmaking than what the Constitution says he must, because his party obviously has to approve a law before they allow their representatives in Parliament to propose and pass it. So in his capacity as president of South Africa, his official role is limited to signing legislation into law and overseeing the executive, which is responsible for enforcing the law. But in his capacity as the president of the ANC and a member of the ANC's National Executive Committee, he probably plays a far more hands-on role in lawmaking, which I would argue is not good, because the separation of powers means that the executive and the legislature are separated in function and in staffing, so you don't have the same people doing the same thing. To ensure that we don't have a concentration of power, unfortunately, the party system in South Africa means that whatever the separation of power says is irrelevant, because there's basically only one institution that makes decisions, and that is simply the ANC. It doesn't matter about Parliament, it doesn't matter the presidency. You only have to look at the party itself and see how power is truly distributed. And that is what Professor Koos Malan, which is my master supervisor, but he's also a public commentator on constitutionalism, he calls this the real constitution in South Africa. It's not the constitution as written is no longer the real constitution, because what it says is not what's happening in real life. In real life, the power is centralized in the African National Congress, and rather than separated between the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. But to get back to whether the courts make law, so that's a very philosophical question that legal academics are still struggling with. But officially and on paper, they do not make law. The courts simply interpret the law. They find so-called find the law, what it means, what it says, and then they apply that to the cases that come before them. But in practice, many people, and I would probably count myself among them, would argue that the courts do make law and that this is unavoidable. Because, of course, in the process of interpreting a law, it often happens that the courts need to make a value judgment to discover what the most legally appropriate meaning of a provision is. And many courts and judges disagree about how to do this. And that obviously means that it often depends on the type of judge or bench of judges that you get. And from one bench to the other, they may disagree radically about what the law means. And that means that the law changes upon their judgment. So, for example, the terrible case of Agri SA versus Minister for Minerals and Energy in 2013, where they interpreted the property rights laws in the Constitution as against the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act. The Constitutional Court basically said that government is allowed to expropriate without compensation the minerals beneath the surface from their private owners, which I would argue the Constitution absolutely does not allow. But the court, in interpreting the provision, said that the Constitution does allow that. Of course, it used some other language, very high legalese, but that is in effect what the court decided. So in that case, I would say the court did make law, because the law before that judgment was radically different from what the law was after that judgment. In that respect, the court absolutely makes law. But in that process, there are legally recognized tools and techniques and methods that it must use to do this interpretive exercise, which our courts unfortunately often do not do, and the reason why South Africa is hurtling down this path towards socialism, because our courts are very government-minded. They basically, when government says we have this ideological mandate that we need to fulfill, our courts unfortunately agree with that and say, yes, you must do this, when in fact the Constitution does not provide for it, and the tools of interpretation do not allow for that conclusion often. So unfortunately, our courts have, I guess, dropped the ball a little bit when it comes to interpretation, and they've ended up being, especially the Constitutional Court, being a third house of parliament, in that it is passing its own laws which do not have any basis in the Constitution. So that's something that South Africans, I would say, should be quite concerned about, but something that we can't really do anything about other than wait for new judges to be appointed, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. Look, here's my next important question. This is probably one of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast. How does the Constitution benefit and protect ordinary South Africans? This is the listeners out there, please, you need to listen to this, because this is the most important question.
Yeah, so we need to be careful and remember that a constitution is meant to limit and circumscribe the power of government. And to the extent that it does this successfully, as I've said, which I think it does pretty well, not perfectly, but it does okay. In that respect, it is benefiting ordinary South Africans. So where it says that government must pass a constitutional amendment through a very strict procedure before it can expropriate your property without compensation, in that respect, it is benefiting and certainly protecting South Africans. But many people, especially on the left, and then also on the right, among conservatives, complain that, for example, if there are poor people, or their culture is somehow being undermined, then the Constitution is failing or not benefiting them. Now, we need to be clear that the Constitution is not meant to make life easy for us or to give us what we want. The Constitution exists to protect us from the excesses of state power, and that means, yes, even the best constitution will allow people to be poor. If you are destitute, the constitution is not going to come to your assistance usually, because this is a market affair. Whether you are poor or rich is something that's determined in the economy. How hard you work, how lucky you are to an extent. It is not a matter of constitutional law. And of course, under the best constitutions in the world, a Muslim might decide to open a mosque down the road and annoy you with their regular calls to prayer. The constitution is not going to come and say that Muslim needs to go away, because the constitution is not there to coddle us or to guard us against the realities of life. So that is a very important thing to remember. And a lot of people on the left in South Africa often complain that South Africa got so-called political freedom in 1994, but not economic freedom. And when they say this, they mean that the constitution gave South Africans individual liberty, but did not make them economically prosperous. And I think this is absurd, because no constitution is meant to make people prosperous. And I think a very practical implication of this is that when the constitution in fact gave South Africans individual liberty, we became prosperous as a result. It's a downstream effect, and I want to refer specifically here to average incomes. So the white and the Indian populations had apartheid ended basically immediately after apartheid ended, and that coincides with when we received the constitution. Because they're finally free to engage in the market without government micromanaging them, as the apartheid government did by saying where they may live, in what jobs they may be. Without that, Indian and white income skyrocketed. Unfortunately, the same did not happen really for blacks and colored people, because shortly after apartheid ended, the new government adopted a set of labor laws and regulations, which it still continues to this day. And these interventions led to the plateauing of black and colored incomes, which also rose after apartheid ended, but only until these laws became operative. So this means that the constitution itself, while it is not intended to make us prosperous, when it unshackled us from this interfering government, the apartheid government, we were finally free to pursue our own economic destinies and affairs, until, of course, government came again and imposed these strict, onerous labor laws on us. And of course, the worst effect of these labor laws will always be on the poor, and the poor at that time was the black and the colored communities. It's of course not to say that blacks and coloreds are economically, or just can't perform in the economy like whites and Indians. The point is that the new government saw its constituency as blacks, mostly blacks, but also coloreds, that it wanted to help them. And I think, as Ronald Reagan said, you should always be concerned if someone comes to you and says they want to help, because then you're in trouble. Government help is not going to help you, rarely if ever, because it's usually going to have some unintended consequence that is going to hurt you even more. So it's not the constitution's job to make us prosperous, but it is a downstream consequence of good constitutionalism that we will become prosperous, except if the government screws it up, which in South Africa it did. Now, I guess I should get a little bit more specific about how the constitution may protect ordinary South Africans. And that is usually going to be the Bill of Rights. So that is Chapter 2 of the Constitution, which sets out the protections for our rights. Some of the notable ones are Section 16.1, right to freedom of expression. Section, I think, 23 is the right to pursue your own profession, your own career freely, and government may regulate that but not prohibit it. Section 25, very important. It's the right to own private property. It is in terms of this provision that you would, for example,
Section 25,
try to evict.
We all know Section 25.
Yes. Yeah, I would argue it's probably the most important provision in the Constitution, because this is where prosperity comes from, private property. If private property is protected, then you are free to emancipate yourself from poverty. You're free to provide for your family without the right to private property. All of that falls away. So that is a very important provision in the Constitution. And unfortunately, for most South Africans, a lot of these rights are out of reach, because going to court is very, very expensive. Lawyers are very expensive. And even though we all have the right to access to justice, which it means to go to court, it's very difficult to get a private lawyer. You'll usually need to get some a legal clinic, go to a legal clinic, and so on.
But how many? I don't know. Is there people that still go out there to the courts and represent themselves? Does it still happen?
So
I hardly see it happen.
I think it does. I cannot say for sure. You in criminal trials, you have an absolute right to represent yourself. I am not sure if this happens a lot in civil cases. I know, of course, in small claims court, you have to do it like that in small claims court. You have to represent yourself. But when it comes to bigger multi-million rand challenges, I'm not sure that ordinary people probably feel comfortable doing it.
But this is the thing that I'm saying, like you just mentioned, people that can't afford it. And I think people out there must just educate themselves on the Bill of Rights, and then, to the best of your knowledge, if you can, represent yourself, you know. But
I think that's...
We're too scared, we're too paranoid.
But you'd never be scared to learn. We should never be scared to learn, and I think teaching oneself about law and the Constitution, I guess it's rich coming from me, who studied law and who's doing a master's in law, but I don't think it's difficult. There's no sums to make. You don't have to know math. You don't have to be a grammar Nazi.
Exactly. You
basically just have to read. Yeah, you basically just have to read.
Yeah, just read and familiar yourself with it. 100%. That's what I wanted. That question to me was the mind-blowing one. That South Africans, we can protect ourselves, but we just need to familiar ourselves with the Bill of Rights. Take the Bill of Rights, people. It's there. It's on the internet. I mean, Martin's got a book. Go on the site, get the book, and read. Educate yourselves.
Yeah. So I think we can look to Americans as a shining example in this, because many Americans really have an intricate understanding of their constitution, even though they are not lawyers. It's because, in part, America has a very strong culture of constitutionalism. Basically, from birth, most American children are taught about this. Yeah, it's part of patriotism.
It is. It's true patriotism.
And they have civics classes where children are taught in school about the Constitution. We absolutely do not have that in South Africa. I mean, they mention the Constitution every now and then in life orientation, but they never really go into the meat of it.
So in America, the Constitution is a subject. It's in the curriculum.
Yeah.
And we don't have it in our curriculum. Look, I went to the bank the other day to pay myself an account, and there was this one guy there, and he was arguing and standing up and saying, "People, we must stand up." It was hilarious to see it. And I looked at him and I said, "You're right. You're right. We should actually go out there and learn our laws, learn our rights. We have rights, but we're just not practicing it." Then I looked at the bank teller and I asked her, "Do you know your rights? Do you know the Constitution?" So she said, "I actually learned it in college." And I said, "Wow, well done," because I haven't. I haven't. And I want to familiar myself with it. And this is what I want to try and do with this podcast. I want to encourage people more to familiar themselves with the Constitution.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not something to be afraid of. It's quite easy, because you do not have to. The Constitution is long, but it has a lot of things in it that ordinary people do not need to understand. You don't need to know the process of mediation between
like the
houses of parliament.
The general provisions that you don't have to know about.
Yeah.
Public administration.
I would say you need to. I think you need to know the Bill of Rights, which is short. You can read through it in an hour, and I think you can understand it. And if you don't, I think there are many places online. You can just do a Google search, and there will be explanations. Yeah. For example, the Department of Justice has a very useful, Bill of Rights guide, which explains the rights in the Bill of Rights in a very layman way, very easy for people to understand.
There you go.
Let me find a link to that, and then I will also share that link. It's not something that you can take to court and say this is what the Department of Justice guide says, but it's a good starting point. You can read that, understand what that says, then you can read the real Bill of Rights.
It's basically a constitution for dummies, but people mustn't feel offended. We shouldn't feel offended. Take the book. It's a starting. Read it, and then as you educate yourselves, and you can actually read the proper thing. But you're right, 100%, Martin, 100%. All right, our next question: how many amendments to the Constitution are there?
Great. So the Constitution has been amended 17 times. That's quite a lot of times. So this Constitution was enacted in 1996.
I'm going to stop you there. How can we compare this to other countries? How many amendments have been made? So the only other country that I can name a number of by heart is the United States, which has had their constitution amended 27 times in 250 years. Exactly.
So that is the proportion is far less. But to be totally fair, these amendments are not substantive amendments to our constitution. Yeah. They're mostly technical. They changed the borders of the provinces. They made like the Chief Justice the head of the whole judiciary rather than just the Constitutional Court. Yeah. They regulate floor crossing. So these amendments were not really substantive. They didn't really affect our rights as South Africans that much, if at all. Of course, the exception is the one that's staring us right in the face today, which is expropriation without compensation, which is the current proposed amendment to the Constitution, which will become known, if it is passed, as the Constitution 18th Amendment Act of 2019. And that this will be the first time that the Bill of Rights is amended in South African history. So it's something that we should be very, very concerned about. But the other amendments, I don't think is something we need to worry too much about, although it is not a good sign in general that we are this amendment happy.
There's one amendment that I'm worried about. It happened this week in the security, where they're changing the gun laws, something about semi-automatic. They're going to take it away, so only cash in transit is allowed to use semi-automatic guns, and I'm concerned about that one.
No, you definitely should be. So, but that's not a constitutional amendment. That's just the law that they're passing. An amendment to the I think the Private Security Industry Regulation Act. Yeah. So we should be very concerned about that law, because when the South African Police Service has now repeatedly said that it is unable to keep South Africans safe. It's not something that they're lying about. They're very clear about the fact that they are failing at their job. Yet, at the very same time, they are trying to disarm South Africans.
Exactly.
So they're not only trying to take away semi-automatic firearms from security companies, they're also trying to take away the reason for obtaining a firearm of self-defense. So the firearm amendment, the Firearms Control Amendment Act, which was leaked late last year, said that they want to remove self-defense as a valid reason for obtaining a firearm license. Think how absurd that is.
Totally.
So if you want to defend yourself, you cannot get a gun, but if you want to go sport shooting, then you can get a gun. It is absurd. It is silly. And I mean, this is a government that is totally open about the fact that it cannot protect us, but now it also wants to take away our right to protect ourselves. It's something that we should be very passionately, and I guess this is another bad part of our constitution. We have no right to bear arms in America, like Americans do in the Second Amendment to their constitution, which says that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But in South Africa, we have no such thing, which is, I mean, you can read the constitution in a way and then say, okay, we actually do have the right to bear arms, but the courts are going to laugh at you if you do that. But as it stands, we have no right to bear arms, and that means the government, with a simple majority in parliament, 50% of parliament plus one, which the ANC has very easily, they can take away your guns right
Yeah.
in an instant. It's done. So that's something we should be very,
Scary.
very concerned about and very aware of, because the moment they start down that route, the only way to stop them is to create massive amounts of outrage and demands and maybe civil action, protests.
Yeah.
And going to court is not going to help on this topic. If you are a gun-owning South African, or you want to become a gun-owning South African, you need to be very aware of what the government is doing, and you must be ready to take real practical action to stop the government from doing that, rather than just saying we're taking it to court.
The paperwork, the amount of time, it's just horrendous. It's crazy. But what I wanted to say was, I've joined the ZACP recently. Well, they still new. And for the first time in my 25 years since we're a democracy state, this is the party that I want to support, because I love what they stand for. And yes, I know people have been making big hoo about the gun laws and that. It's not about that. It's about you as an individual. Can you protect yourself in that? So all my podcasts, well, the recent ones, I've mentioned ZACP. ZACP, to you guys out there, Ramon and Kenton, whatever you guys are doing, I love it. You guys are awesome.
Yeah. So a lot of political parties in South Africa do not take self-defense seriously. They rarely mention it. The big parties all talk about, we need to fix the police service. No, I think you need to start, and I think the ZACP gets this. Them and the Freedom Front to a smaller extent, they get this. They say you need to start with the ability to protect yourself. Yeah. The police is very important. It's very important to have a good police force. But if you do not have the ability to protect yourself, then you've already failed. Then it's tickets. It's done already. You need to have the ability to protect yourself. And in South Africa, that means private citizens should be allowed to relatively easily, and I would argue very easily, get a firearm that shoots real bullets that can kill people. Because I promise you that criminals do not care what the gun laws say. They do not care if guns are banned completely, because they will always have guns. They will smuggle guns. They will smuggle guns. Yeah, they will smuggle guns across the border, and they get guns from the police. This is something that very few people know.
Yeah, true.
The police proportionally to how large the police force is, loses, and I put it in scare quotes, they lose these guns at a far higher rate than civilians lose or have their guns stolen.
True.
So the police are the big culprits here. So even if all private guns are taken off the streets of South Africa, the police will not stop, quote, losing their guns to the criminals, and foreign arms smugglers are not going to stop importing guns into South Africa. Even if we secure our borders tightly, that will not stop a criminal. A criminal wants to get something done, as a criminal is going to get something done. We need ordinary South Africans like you and I to be able to own a firearm with very few exceptions. I think we can make a case for, yes, if you're insane, if you have a criminal record, sure. But on the whole, ordinary people should be able to get a gun easily.
Look, I'm in the security industry, okay, and I deal with this a lot. We make a lot of arrests, and with unemployment rate where it is, and you know, when we arrested people, whether it be in stealing, and I look at some of the people that we arrest, and I look at the way they're dressed neatly, they drive nice cars, and I asked him, why are you doing this? And I looked at him and I said, well, I guess I know the answer to it, but I want to hear it from you. And he said to me straight, there's no work. I have to pay rent. I've got 2 children to support. And it's exactly with the other criminals out there. They go and get guns. It's become a full-time job. I mean, I know of instances that the guy that stands at the gate, or the guy that stands at the door, the guy that does the window shopping, it's like there's positions. Each of them have got positions, and they get paid according to a certain rate, right? You at this gate, you need to get paid so much, and you standing there, you need to get paid so much. It's a career. It's become a career, and that's how scary it is out there.
Yeah.
All right, Martin. How many minutes are we going to do this last question? I've kept you.
I think we should talk about expropriation quickly.
You've been absolutely awesome. You've been awesome. Go for it. What are the implications? Okay. What are the implications of expropriation without compensation as an amendment to the Constitution?
Okay, so let me run through this pretty quickly because this is something I work quite a lot with.
Yeah.
So the right to private property in the Constitution, Section 25, currently says that all South Africans, regardless of race, are entitled to have their property secure. So government may not arbitrarily deprive you of your property without paying just and equitable compensation when it expropriates from you. Mm-hmm. That, and then the words just and equitable are very important here, because it does not mean that they must give you market value. Now, I as a libertarian argue that they must give you market value and then some, even far more than market value. Mm-hmm. But as far as the Constitution goes, they do not need to give you market value. This means that the government's current existing power to expropriate is quite generous already. Mm-hmm. So it may expropriate your property in the public interest or for a public purpose if you are paid just and equitable compensation. This is an international standard. In every country that is successful around the world, when private property is taken, the government pays, if not market value, it pays very close to market value. Mm-hmm. And there's a very important reason for that, because if they do not pay you compensation, then they deny that you ever owned that property. They basically take, in many cases, your livelihood away from you, and you are left with nothing. Now, in a rights-respecting democracy, this cannot be. There needs to be an acknowledgement that government is taking this property from someone who has a prior claim, a prior right to that property, and in its attempt to make right the situation that it is creating by expropriating the property, it gives you money so that you can at least buy new property, carry on, do something else with the money, that you're not left a man of straw. Mm. Now, what the government is currently doing, it is proposing expropriation without compensation, and a lot of people are saying land expropriation without compensation. The Constitution says that property is not limited to land. Mm-hmm. So if this constitutional amendment says that the government may expropriate in the public interest or for a public purpose, and it creates an exemption for compensation that says that government doesn't always need to pay compensation, this will probably apply to all property.
Yeah.
Your pension, your car, your house, anything and everything that government wants, if it has some kind of convoluted reason to do it for social justice or for the redistribution, it can take it. And we've already seen that government is very keen on getting pension funds, on getting into people's money to bail out their failing bloody state-owned enterprises. So government probably has a far more nefarious intention here than to just take land and to give that to people, to its constituency, because that's the government knows that it's going to take far more than mere redistribution of land to solve South Africa's current problem, and mm-hmm. redistribution of land is not going to solve anything. It's going to make it even worse.
It's going to make it worse.
Yeah, it's going to make it far worse. We've seen this in Zimbabwe. We've seen this in Venezuela. Yeah. And it's usually because the government does not want to let go of ownership of that property. So in Venezuela and in Zimbabwe, what happened was the government expropriated it, and it either kept the property in its name and leased it out to so-called farmer.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Or it gave it to its political friends. That property will always fail, because if you have an incentive to develop that property, to keep it in top shape and to use it productively. If you do not own it, if you're renting it, that incentive, while it is still there, is far less. And of course, then we can talk about skills and so forth. That government is not.
There's no joy. There's no joy in it, because if you don't have a title deed, you can't go to the bank and make loans, because you need to buy feed. Okay, I know we're talking about farms now, but it doesn't have to necessarily be farms. It could be a plant where you're making plastics. You need to have that title deed. But without a title deed, what can you do? Absolutely nothing.
Yeah, exactly. And far more pertinently, the fact is that if you know you received this property, which was taken without compensation from someone else, and you now have to farm it, why the hell would you invest your time and money into that property if you now know that the government can come tomorrow and take it from you again?
Exactly.
So it's like you got this property for free. It's not like, okay, government is now never going to take it back from you. We're seeing it right now in Zimbabwe. The new government is saying that it will give expropriated farms back to white farmers. Do you think that the people who have been put on those farms since did not know that this was going to happen? Of course they knew. They knew that, okay, I got this for free. I do not have any right to this property. I'm renting it. Government can come back at any moment and take it from me again.
Yeah.
Now it's very important to see that this is what is probably going to happen in South Africa, because the government declared in its, I think it's 2013 state land policy document or something like that. It said that it is going to stop transferring ownership of expropriated properties to new beneficiaries. It is instead going to keep it and rent it out. That is official government policy in South Africa as we speak today, and that has not changed. So it's expropriation without compensation happens. The government is going to be like, oh yes, what we're doing now is addressing the original sin. We're giving property back to the people, when in fact that is absolutely not what it's going to do. It is going to rent it out, and it's going to crash the economy, of course.
This is the thing, the majority are not informed about this. They have absolutely no knowledge on it. That's the scary part.
Yeah, and it's a total slippery slope, because the moment we allow government to come in and fiddle with the right to property like this, there is very little that's going to stop it to come in and, for example, fiddle with the right to freedom of expression, and something that this government will be very keen on, and which this will basically allow it to do in a political sense, is to take away the testing right of the courts. It can say that the courts can no longer stonewall government, because that's not even part of the Bill of Rights. But the government can pass a constitutional amendment saying the courts should only be involved in criminal and civil cases. If you challenge government in court, or if you challenge a law in court, then the constitution can be amended to say that the courts can't do that anymore. And I think that's probably one of the things that government is getting very excited about, because if we signal to it that it's okay to start taking away our rights in this way, then we're basically saying you can do it for other things as well. I mean, it's very naive to believe that it's going to stop at that property rights. And I think the moment the constitution is amended to provide for expropriation without compensation, that will to an extent be the end of constitutionalism in South Africa, because that it's just going to open the floodgates, as it has in Zimbabwe, where a constitution there means nothing. It's not even worth the toilet. It's not even worth the paper it's written on. It's worth less than toilet paper. And the same in Venezuela, which had a strong constitution before Hugo Chavez, and then they made these changes, and now you will not find one Venezuelan who cares, much less knows what their constitution says, because they know it's worthless. And we as South Africans need to protect the constitution against this. And we had an opportunity in this election. Unfortunately, we failed dismally, because now government has the requisite majority. It has 66.3% of the National Assembly, and that is what it needs.
That was my next question.
The ANC and their friends.
That was my next question. According to the constitution, it needs 2/3 of the majority.
Yes.
Is that what's happening now?
Yeah, so the let's say the pro expropriation alliance, that is the EFF, ANC, ATM, who else? Some of these other obscure parties, they are pro expropriation, and they give the government currently a 2/3 majority,
including Good, Patricia's party.
It remains to be seen whether the law is going to vote with the ANC on that. Probably now that she's a member of cabinet.
That was a shocker.
Let's not.
Let's not dwell here. No, you're right.
Let's not say that she will do that. Maybe she won't. But the point is, even if her whole party doesn't, they still have enough. The ANC and the EFF alone, just the two of them, have enough to amend the constitution. So it's a foregone conclusion that if they want to amend the constitution, they absolutely can. Now there is an argument that I am a proponent of, and which a few other people are a proponent of, to say that you actually need 75% of the National Assembly to amend that provision.
I read that up somewhere. Yeah, 75%. Yeah.
Yes. So the argument, very briefly, relates to Section 1 of the Constitution. Now, Section 1 of the Constitution are the founding values. It says that South Africa is a sovereign democratic state founded, and there are many values, but I'll mention two, founded upon the advancement of human rights and freedoms, and founded upon the supremacy of the rule of law. These are two values which, along with anything else in Section 1, can only be amended with a 75% majority of parliament. So that's higher than the 2/3 majority. Now, the argument that me and others are making is that if you amend property rights in this way to provide for expropriation without compensation, you are not only affecting Section 25, for which you need a 2/3 majority, you are also affecting Section 1. Because such an amendment means that South Africa is no longer founded upon the advancement of human rights and freedoms, because you have now taken away a human right and a human freedom. And South Africa is no longer founded upon the supremacy of the rule of law, because by making this amendment, you're attacking what is considered to be a historical element of the rule of law, which is the protection of private property, which from the day of Albert Van Duyse has been seen as a component of the rule of law. So that's very briefly the argument that me and others, a few others, are making, but which the courts probably will not accept, but it's an argument we make nonetheless, that yes, you need 2/3 to amend the Bill of Rights, but if you amend it in this way to actually not strengthen a right or to change a right, but to actually weaken that right, then you need more than a 2/3 majority. You need a 75% majority. Now, this is an argument that will probably be made in court by someone. If expropriation without compensation is brought into law, and we hope that the Constitutional Court will say, yes, you're right, government actually needs 75%. But I will not hold my breath for that. I have very little faith in the Constitutional Court for various reasons. It's always seemed to be pro-government rather than pro-individual rights. So I'm not a betting man, and I'm not saying that the Constitutional Court will agree. But it's an argument we will have to make. But what ordinary South Africans need to do, and we're failing in this, is we need to be continuously and purposefully outraged about anything related to expropriation without compensation.
Absolutely.
We are not talking about this enough. If, for example, imagine Donald Trump or the Democrats or whoever in America announced, we are going to amend the Constitution to provide for expropriation without compensation. There would be, if not a civil war, there will be people in the streets every single day until they retract that idea completely. We are not doing that in South Africa. We're moving on. We're talking about corruption. We're talking about GDP. We're talking about, SAA, Eskom, Pravin Gordhan, good. We should be talking about expropriation without compensation every single day until this government says we are going to leave the Constitution alone. And that means we need to keep barging or banging this drum continuously and say, no, we do not want expropriation without compensation.
I got something that I want to share with you. I was watching the podcast Big Daddy Liberty with Frans Cronje. And of course, I'm going to be paraphrasing here what he said. And this is what he said. And I copied it down, I typed it down a bit, and exactly in everything you just said, this is what he said. You have to understand the deep origins of the problem. You cannot address it. To accept ideological framework that gives rise to this mad policy. Once you have done that, you need to educate people about it so they can begin to understand what it is. All politics and policy influences is about balance of power. If you can create balance of power in public opinion that pushes in one direction or another, you can make public policy follow. You need to shift the tide by using small arguments daily at 1,000 times over to many people across the globe. Frans Cronje. Frans Cronje, that was awesome what he said there. Absolutely mind-blowing. Yeah.
It's 100% correct. A lot of people think that their voice does not count. They're going to be one voice in a sea of a million. Now, let me let you in on a little secret here.
Yeah.
The civil society in South Africa the amount of voices that there already are is not 55 million. I think that number is far closer to something like 1,000. So if you look at people who are influencing, not people outside government, people who are really influencing where government goes, I think that number is around 1,000, maybe max 10,000 South Africans who are like journalists, academics, ordinary people with a blog. These are people who are having a true influence on where government goes. It's not 55 million.
Yeah.
That means that if we can get from your show, if 100 people listen to the show, and only 100 people, for example, each write 500-word article saying why expropriation without compensation is a bad idea, and they get that published in blogs, in the Rational, as letters, that can truly, really shift public policy totally.
Yes.
It can really have an effect, and this is something that people do not believe. And I promise you, it is 100% true. You, as an ordinary South African, can do a hell of a lot if you go on podcasts, if you write articles,
Absolutely.
and you just write something on Twitter or on Facebook giving your opinion. You can, as an individual, actually change the direction of public policy. Now, if 100 of us all say expropriation without compensation is bad, that can truly shift public opinion, and it can shift public policy.
You know what the power of podcast is, eh? My podcast, I viewed the Analytics some time ago, is viewed in Vietnam, America, UK, Australia, even Switzerland. My podcast has been listened in quite a few countries, and it amazes me. Amazes me how far the power of podcasting can do, eh?
It's a brave new world.
Yeah, it's a brave new. Martin, okay, I'm going to cut you there. I think I've taken up too much of your time already, but you have been absolutely awesome. Awesome.
I have enjoyed every moment of it.
You know, to the listeners out there, this is absolutely brain-boggling. I mean, guys, really, if you guys don't pay attention to what Martin's been saying here, then you were a fool. Then you were a fool. Martin's right, and even Frans Cronje, what he said there, 1,000 voices, over and over and over. You know, just do it, man. Don't hesitate. Just do it. Martin, thank you very much.
Yeah.
You have a lovely afternoon. I'm gonna have a bra now. I'm gonna get some meat. I'm gonna bra because that's what we do on a Saturday afternoon. We bra.
No, of course. No, thank you very much, Jason. I enjoyed every moment of this, and I hope to be back in the future again.
100%. Thank you very much, Martin. I'm gonna cut and then I'm gonna come back to you. Okay. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Bye bye. One more thing. My podcast is available on Apple, Google Podcast, Spotify, Pocket Cast. I will put this also on YouTube tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll upload it. So yeah, thank you very much. Thanks. Bye bye.